Welcome, everyone. Thanks so much to you all for joining us this evening. Really warm welcome to the IOE. So, for those of you who don't know me, I'm Professor Becky Francis. I'm the Director of the UCL Institute of Education, and I'm really pleased to be introducing this evening's lecture as another opportunity to share and celebrate our professors' research and expertise. So, I'm afraid, first of all, the usual housekeeping matters. You'll have hopefully seen the Wi-Fi login details as you came in, and the Twitter hashtag is #IOE Lectures. That's all one word, #IOE Lectures. And we're not expecting a fire drill, so if the alarm sounds, please do take the doors at the back of the hall, which will lead you up the stairs onto Bedford Way. And if anyone's unable to use the stairs, move to the left of the hall and our fire marshals will escort you out of the building. Now I can introduce our speaker for this evening, Louise Archer, Karl Mannheim Professor, Chair of Sociology of Education here at the IOE. Louise moved to the IOE in 2017, before which she was Professor of Sociology of Education at King's College London. Louise's research focuses on educational identities and inequalities, particularly in relation to gender, ethnicity, and social class. And to date, it's encompassed research on Muslim pupils, British Chinese pupils, the minority ethnic middle classes, urban young people in schooling, widening participation in higher education, and most recently, inequalities in science participation. Now, to date, I'm very pleased to say, as Director of the IOE, Louise has won over £8 million in research funding and authored an enormous number of highly cited works, and she's a Fellow of the Academy of Social Sciences. But as well as being highly esteemed in relation to traditional academic criteria, what's also notable about Louise's work is its engagement with and impact on other audiences. So in addition to the research income and academic publications that I've just noted, since 2013, Louise has published numerous reports for policy and practitioner audiences, as well as presented over 40 keynote lectures, often to science-related organisations. She served as president of the 2018 British Science Festival in the Sociology and Social Policy section, and as vice president, education, of the British Science Association. This really is to be celebrated and speaks to the impact that Louise has had. For her research on inequalities in science participation, this includes impact on government policy, on professional and learned societies, third sector organisations, museums and science centres and funders, as well as, of course, schools, colleges and universities, nationally and internationally. Her concept of science capital, particularly, has resounded and become part of the vocabulary of the international science participation field. And here I should also note Louise's role in initiating the National Athena Swan Scheme, which has had such a powerful impact on universities' practice to advance gender equality, and which provides another illustration of Louise's long-standing concern to bring about positive change. Providing testament to these achievements, just this month, Louise and her research team, many of whom are here today, were shortlisted for the prestigious ESRC Prize for Research Impact, and we await the announcement of the winner with trepidation. In the meantime, let's hear more from Louise. Louise, can I invite you to give your lecture?
Thank you. It's a real privilege to be able to come and do this lecture. There's always a bit of a question before a lecture like this as to should you do your medley of greatest hits, or should you use it as an excuse to unleash that difficult new material you've been storing away? So for those of you who are of my demographic and who remember vinyl, I've gone for the equivalent of a B-side and that difficult second album. Of course, research is not a solo endeavour. It's a collaborative product and process, and there are just so many people that before I start I need to thank for their role in supporting and producing what I'm going to present here. There are loads of academics whose work has been absolutely inspirational and so important for me, but I didn't want to try and list them because you can't ever do all of that. But particularly the feminist and critical scholars, some of hopefully that will come through in some of the talk today. But I also want to particularly thank friends and colleagues, both at UCL IOE here and also where I was before at King's. And I particularly want to thank members of the project teams listed there, whose work I'm going to be drawing on tonight. And this is probably incomplete, it's probably not everyone up there, but hopefully project team members, thank you. You can see your names there. And also, as Becky intimated at, one of the themes of my research has been around trying to achieve impact, and you can't do this alone. And so I'm really, really grateful to all the policymakers, practitioners and funders and people that we've worked with, who many of you I can see in the audience already. Hopefully, again, you can scroll down. It's alphabetical, you can find yourself. If you're not there, it's my error, and you should be. So thank you to you as well. And also, just before I start, I want to say a personal thanks to my family. My husband, Matt's in the front row there, looking embarrassed. My children, Martha and Jamie, who are wonderful. I wouldn't say couldn't be here tonight. We didn't let them come tonight. But Martha drew this picture to show you what they're like. And you'll notice Matt by the drawn-on, felt tip pen beard in the front row. But she left her grey pen kindly at home for that one. So I wanted to thank my family, all of Matt's family, my mum, dad, and just wanted to say in memory tonight, the talk will be in memory of my wonderful dad, John, pictured there, and my brother Adam, both of whom sadly passed away. So what are we going to talk about tonight? Two main questions. So the first is a long-standing one. Why are educational inequalities so powerful and so resistant to change? And to do this, I'm going to try and explore some of the uses, but also the limitations of Borges' theory. And I'm also going to ask the question, well, is change possible? And if so, what is the role of the critically engaged scholar, or in my case, the sociologist of education in that? Cautionary word before we begin, it's not going to be fun. Here we have a nice 80s reference. Glenn Frey was in the Eagles. Saying no fun allowed in this talk, but there are reasons for this. So the first is obviously the subject matter of inequalities is really, really serious and important. But also from a sociological perspective, I've been interested to read about the sociology of fun, which they call funology. Who knew? So that tells us that fun is about a forgetting of the self, that's embodied, ephemeral, sociable, maybe not such a sociable arena that we're in right now. It's distracting, not serious, and not intended to reveal anything about the self. Whereas I'm hoping tonight we'll be foregrounding selves, not just our own, but particularly the selves of others, and hopefully thinking a bit and revealing something about the workings of society. So I'm going to hopefully take my own advice, as I've been writing recently, in the context of informal science learning context, and saying maybe rather than aiming for fun, we should just aim for interesting. That's the aim. So across the talk, there's going to be a bit of a balancing act between optimism and pessimism. So the notion of, well, can educational inequalities be challenged and overcome or ameliorated or not? And can research make any difference or not? Does it have a role to play? Just to give you a sense of where we're going to go in the talk tonight, here's a little emotional map. You can see our pessimism-optimism scale there on the y-axis. And I've plotted us as starting reasonably optimistically. We've probably all come here with the hope we can do something about it. You'll see as we start to talk about Borgia, we're going to go through a rapid, steep decline. Borgia is not known for his optimism. We're going to have challenges to Borgia, when we're going to feel more optimistic there. Then we're going to hit on nadir, talking about the role of the academic, before briefly climbing out of that and coming back up. And you'll see there, if you look at my 5-point scale, that I'm aiming for us to land exactly in the midpoint, 2.5 on that scale, very deliberately, with a glass half full, glass half empty scenario, which will be replicated in your institutional glass of wine at the end of the lecture. And I'm very much hoping that this glass half full, half empty will be that mythical object which will satisfy both the 48%ers and the 52%ers among you. So, why are educational inequalities so powerful and resistant to change? So we're going to use Borja for this. And for me, the work of Borja, who is represented there nicely amongst his books, is very much like the proverbial box of chocolates. Now, in this case, the box of chocolates that I've gone for is deliberately Quality Street. And I spent rather longer than is necessary thinking about this analogy. Because Quality Street, for me, is classic and enduring, like Borgia's work, but also, let's say, it's of its time. Now, I'm deliberately, for legal purposes of the filming, not calling it old-fashioned. But I think the analogy also works in the sense that, for me, Borgia is mostly satisfying, but it does have the odd rogue element. So for me personally, his work on masculine domination is very much the impalatable, hard, chewy toffee penny. I don't want it. Whereas for me, the logic of practice, a personal favourite, is either the purple one or the green triangle, if you know your Quality Street. But like all chocolates, it's not the only one on the market. And for me, it's far more palatable in conjunction with feminist and critical work and updatings of Borgia by people like Bev Skeggs and Diane Ray. And, of course, black feminist intersectional theory, people like Hill Collins and Bell Hooks, which for me are very much the Lindor of the academic chocolate world. And we shall leave the chocolate analogies there. So, Borgia's work. There's a very long history of very productive work using Borgia's theory to explain educational inequalities. And a lot has been written, and I've talked a lot previously about his key contributions being around the interaction of habitus, capital, and field, and how it's this interaction that produces relations of inequality. Now, because I've talked about this many times, and some of you here have heard that talk very, very many times, I'm not going to rehearse it here. Just to note, though, because a couple of the terms come up later, that habitus very much refers to that notion of the socialised, embodied dispositions that we develop over time that gives what's referred to as the feel for the game. Capital is the resources that you have, the different sorts, cultural, economic, social, the hand you have to play in the game, and field being the social, spatial set of power relations that sets the rules of the game. So, like others, we in our project teams have found this really useful for trying to understand patterns in inequality and how young people engage with science or not. And it formed the basis of the Science Capital teaching approach, in which we advocate that rather than trying to change the young person, it's more productive to try and change the field, to try and change practices around that, which is less of a deficit approach. So, tonight we're going to try and move beyond habitus, capital and field and talk about two other concepts that I've found very useful but which I haven't talked so much about, which are symbolic violence and pedagogic work. And I'm going to try and exemplify them with data from two different studies. The first study led by Professor Francis, the Best Practice in Grouping Student Study, and I can see various colleagues from that around here. And the second one, the Aspires 2 study, which again we have various colleagues here. And I think I saw another one at that. So to start with symbolic violence. So this is the idea that those who are dominated come to accept their position and their less favourable life chances and resources and outcomes and so on as justified or as natural, as inevitable. And often as a result of your own lesser talents. So the idea of, I'm no good at that, I'm not very clever. So a notion of self-blame. Whereas the privileged position of dominant groups is attributed to their superior talents. So rather than being due to inequalities, it's right and natural that the privileged groups should have the best resources, the best options, chances in society. So as Bourdieu and Passeron write, it's the idea of convincing the disinherited that they owe their scholastic and social destiny to their lack of gifts or merits. So it's interesting, this concept, that we applied it in the Best Practice in Grouping Students study to try and explain the practice of school setting. So as many of you will know, particularly in the UK, this practice of setting is incredibly common in England, especially in secondary schools, and particularly in subjects like maths in particular. And as Becky and others have written on that project, middle-class parents, and as I found out in my own experience in, let's say, right-wing social media reaction to my Borja article, which was unexpected for an academic article, but middle-class parents and some factions of society are very, very supportive of setting and strongly argue for it. As Becky's paper notes, it's associated with notions of natural ability, of the natural order, and of a notion of standards, that somehow setting is about having high, good standards, and it's a natural reflection of ability. Whereas the project points out very strongly, as others do, that the evidence doesn't stack up for the benefits of setting, that really it doesn't have a whole heap of benefit, apart from maybe a very small marginal benefit for those in the top sets, but it definitely has negative consequences for those who are put in the lower or bottom sets. So the best practice in grouping students study did lots of surveys, as you can see there, and interviews and discussion groups. And that work, as others have shown it's not by chance who ends up in the bottom sets. So statistically, the pupils most likely to be there are boys, those on free school meals, black students. And also that setting is not based primarily on just on attainment. So we were interested in studying, well, how did students feel about the sets that they were in? Did they think it was fair? Did they think it was a reflection of their natural aptitude? And it's very striking that the top set students, perhaps unsurprisingly, would talk about feeling happy or proud to be in the top sets. Middle set students, still positive, but not quite as positive as the top set. They feel good, it's okay. Better than being in the bottom sets is another phrase that's often used. Whereas our bottom set students would talk about feeling bad, embarrassed, I want to work my way up. Or as one young person, Nisa, put it, I almost died when they're put in the bottom set. And they also didn't all feel it. Some of them felt it's fair and some of them didn't feel it was fair. So the top set were the most likely to feel that setting reflected differences in both ability and effort. So how hard you tried, how well you behaved. Whereas the bottom set were more likely to express more ambivalent views. So the idea there of students saying, well, I think we should all go higher. Why can't I move up if I do my best? Or I just never seem to move on, however well I try, however well I do and how hard I try. So I thought this is, in a way, interesting that symbolic violence is there, but it's also not total. To an extent, the bottom set students, in a way, in these quotes, are questioning the fairness of their allocation and their continued position in the bottom sets. But at the same time, I think we can see the workings of symbolic violence in that there's very little explicit challenging. It was disliked, but largely accepted as to where you are. And it was generally seen as an individual problem, a problem of the self rather than a collective problem. There were no students asking, why are so many black students in the bottom sets, for example. It wasn't recognised as due to racism and other inequalities. So I think this also shows the importance of what Wellner and Burris talk about, of the real need to foreground the views and experiences of those who lose out in practices like setting. We've also picked up this theme in our work on student science identity, and in Aspires 2 in the Enterprising Science project. Our surveys repeatedly, we did them several times with different cohorts, consistently showed that when you look at students' views of science, their feelings of how sciencely they are, and so on, the most positive views are, perhaps unsurprisingly, expressed by the top set, medium views expressed by the middle set, and the least positive views expressed by the bottom set. But across all of these different surveys, different sample types, we found that in schools that don't set, the views of young people statistically group with top set students. So they're vastly more positive in schools that don't set. Which for us raises the question, why on earth do we set students? It's not helping their views of a subject, making them want to continue. Most of them are feeling bad about where they're placed or not that great. So if we applied Borges, it would tell us that setting is not really about fairness at all. It's teaching young people to know their place. It's about maintaining the social order, and in particular, it's about defending and reproducing the interests of the dominant. So it supports the idea of inequality as natural, and And it also justifies why those students who we see as statistically more likely to be in the top set, the white, the middle class, and so on, are more likely to be able to then access the best resources, and this is seen as right and fair and isn't challenged. It also enables the separation from imagined contamination, so the idea that we're protecting those students because otherwise they'll be put off by these badly behaved, lower achieving students in the bottom sets. So, as Grenfell and James have written, it's a process through which social classifications become educational classifications, and it ensures compliance and the reproduction of inequalities. So I now want to think about pedagogic work. So this is the idea of prolonged systemic practices that are performed by a setting or an institution, in Borges' sense a school, a church or a political party, to produce particular kinds of habitus and enduring dispositions. And the aim of pedagogic work is very much to keep order and to reproduce the values and interests of the dominant, training us to accept things as just the way it is. And I found pedagogic work particularly useful for understanding the fascinating world that is school physics. So on our Aspires surveys, we found that physics students were statistically distinctive compared to other students. So they were much more likely than other science students, those taking like biology and chemistry but not physics, and also students, A-level students in general, to feel more mathematical, have a higher self-science, self-concept, so generally have more pro-science views, but also, intriguingly for us, they were much more likely to have stereotypical views and to see scientists as odd, male and geeky. Now this is interesting for us because a lot of the sector's work at trying to encourage more young people into physics is often geared around the notion of, or science in general even, that actually we need to change the stereotypical views of those who don't participate. So the problem is that all those who don't take physics is because they think scientists are odd, male and geeky. But our data was suggesting, no, they don't particularly think that. The people who have that stereotype are your A-level physicists. So what's going on? So we would understand this as evidence of pedagogic work by the field of physics, and this notion that over time it's cultivating a particular way of thinking, a particular habitus, and it's weeding out those who don't fit. So the weeding out happens through various practices I'm going to talk about in a minute, and the cultivation happens through this association of physics over time with masculinity and with cleverness. So the alignment of physics with masculinity is not new. In our data, we were struck that boys reported receiving stronger encouragement from their teachers, as you can see there. Whether or not their teachers gave it, the boys felt that that was the case. And there were lots of examples in our data of girls talking about the everyday ways that physics got aligned with masculinity. So the quote there, "My teacher said you need a boy brain," was from a young woman who was at an A-level choices evening and thinking about whether to do physics and maths, and she was in an independent, very pro-science girls' school. And the teacher said that, you need a boy brain to do physics and maths. This has been found in other research, like Heidi Carlone's excellent study in the States, where girls' higher attainment in physics gets explained away by teachers. They're just working really hard, whereas the boys are naturally great, but they're just lazy. And we also have seen examples in various studies around the notion of boys talking science through muscular intellect. These very confident, overconfident, slightly aggressive, competitive displays of scientific terminology, deriding and telling off students who get the wrong words or answers, and so on. And in our data, we saw a process of gender alignment, where over time, the girls who self-defined as girly girls were much more likely to drop physics, and the girls who continued with it were more likely to moderate their femininity, so their ways of dressing and talking. As one young woman, Davina, put it, when we talked to her when she was in year 8, age sort of 11, 12, 13, she was being a sort of performing a fairly feminine femininity, whereas when we talked to her in A-level physics, she said, well, I dress like a boy and I swear like a sailor now. That's not all women in physics, but... The alignment of cleverness, again, is very, very strong and is achieved through hard and soft gatekeeping practices. So we have examples of young women who wanted to do physics but who were not allowed onto the course. Either their attainment wasn't high enough or they were gently massaged away from it, or physically not allowed to continue because they did not achieve high enough, for example, during their first year of A-level. We know from work of organisations represented in the room, like the IOP and the RSC, that there is grade severity in physics, and we also found a range of pedagogical practices in physics where physics is constantly, the young people are telling us, being presented as you don't get the real physics for a very long time. You're not mature enough to handle the real physics. We'll give you a version of it, but then we'll keep changing it. And as one young person put it, who went on to A-level, experienced it as a process of lies, slowly becoming less lies as he progressed. So we make it really hard for young people to continue with physics. And this notion of being really clever is very masculinised as well. This idea that if you have to work hard, that somehow you're not good enough, was very much expressed by the young women in the sample more so than the young men. And just to give you an example of why we interpret this as a process of cultivation of the habitus over time, this is Victor, who is currently studying a degree in astrophysics. And Victor is, when he was in year 6, at the end of primary, you can see that like other students, lots of students express very similar views here. He just exemplifies it nicely. He says, well, you don't have to be clever to do science. He wasn't born with this view that science is associated with cleverness. Over time, you can see it creeping in. So in year 8, well, I think you have to be a little bit clever, probably quite clever. In year 9, people keen on science, they're not average people. They're cleverer than most people. And by year 11, it's fairly solidified. Yes, you have to be clever. So this happens over time as a process of socialisation. And that, with Victor, is also happening across different stages of different schools, different educational stages, different teachers, different curricula. The same message is getting filtered in the whole time. So looking at our data, we found that physics degree students are rather exceptional. They are not the norm. So, for example, Hannah and Victor were the two young people who went on to do physics degrees, and they were not normal. They had very high family science capital. They had strong, but not the most exceptional, but strong attainment. And they had early science aspirations that were sustained over time. They also had repeated strategic investments by their family to support those aspirations. And they engaged in very sustained identity work. But they were the exceptions. The majority of young people get weeded out along the way. Even those who really like physics and who have a strong interest in it and aspirations. And there's a quote there from a young woman called Kate who did A-level physics. And Kate was the highest attaining student in our sample. She had A's and A stars across the board at GCSE and A-level, including in physics. And as you can see there, she likes it. She says, I think I've always liked physics, but always thought it was quite hard, so maybe not for me. I wouldn't do a straight physics degree because it would be too hard. Like I think I'm just put off thinking it would be really hard. So the eagle-eyed among you will note the very subtle notion that Kate thinks it's hard that is in that quote. But the issue here for us is that if not Kate, then who? Kate is our very highest attaining young person, and when I interviewed her after this, I said to her, but if you can't do it, who can do it? And it was more of a rhetorical question. But it does raise that question of why do we make it so hard for young people, but particularly for young women, to continue with physics and to imagine themselves into it? And there's a quote there from Jenkins, which I think helps here, which is that exclusion works most powerfully through self-exclusion. So there are barriers that stop young people, but also it's the convincing them through the cultivation of the habitus that works very powerfully. Young people will choose to opt out when they don't fit. So my argument here is that a Borgesian lens can give us a different, useful and complex understanding of issues shaping participation in science. And it's revealing that the patterns that we see in areas like physics aren't random. They're not just produced by differences in attainment or quote-unquote natural ability, but rather they're socially produced. And I think this helps call into question some of the dominant ideas we work with in this sector, like the science pipeline. So those of you who work in the area of science education will be very, very, very familiar with this. It's in every single report that's, I think, ever written. This notion that there's a pipeline and that young people are leaking out along the way. What we're trying to get to is the little cup at the end, and that we just need to plug those gaps, keep more of the liquid in the system, and that cup at the end will increase. I think a Borgesian lens shows this pipeline metaphor just does not hold up. What we've got instead is a rigged bingo machine. Now, admittedly, this is a thinly veiled attempt to show a picture from one of my favourite series, which is Better Call Saul. If you don't know it, check it out. But in this clip, Saul has rigged the bingo machine. He has filled the balls with a metallic substance, and he uses a magnet. So basically, he fixes which balls come out. And I think this is a better metaphor than the science pipeline, because it is not chance which balls are coming out. So if nothing else, let's move away from the pipeline to a rigged bingo machine in our reports. But there are limitations of Borgia. Borgia is not so good on transformation and change. He's good at telling us why inequalities get reproduced, but not so good at saying why does change happen, or why do changes in class relations happen, why do some people go against the grain of social reproduction. And there's some excellent work in this area by Diane and Jill and colleagues and David, examples of young people in higher education and settings who go against the grain of reproduction, whether it's white students, the white working class students who access elite institutions and so on. A lot of this change tends to be explained at the level of the individual habitus. And I think it's much harder using Borgia's theory to understand how equitable and just practices might exist in institutionalised forms in different settings at that broader level. I also think that Borgia does not pay a lot of attention to affect and emotion in his work. And I'm going to try and discuss these two limitations using examples from the Youth Equity and STEM study. So this is a 4-year project. As you can see here, it's got multiple partners, many, many partners, so I'm not going to read out because it would take a long time. But 4-year study, and it's trying to understand what would support equity and social justice for young people in out-of-school, informal science learning settings, particularly among young people aged 11 to 15 from communities that are historically underrepresented in STEM. So there are lots of partners, lots of settings in that project, but I'm just going to choose 2 young people from one programme that we looked at on that project to try and exemplify this. And the 2 young people, their pseudonyms are Lulabelle and Star, and I'm also going to talk about the practitioner who ran the programme, who is called Karl. So the setting is a small local authority-run zoo. There's a very strong social justice ethos in the setting, and the young people in this particular case were taking part in a week-long holiday programme. It involved a mixture of sort of classroom-style settings. They learnt about habitats, adaptation, things like that, practical activities, and there was a strong theme of environmental awareness running through it as well. They did lots of practical activities. They would weigh and animal feed, do stuff with the animals. They'd make bird boxes, bug hotels, things that would sit and remain in the zoo, posters for visitors, and so on. Just to give you a sense of Lulabelle and Star, Lulabelle is a white working class girl. She's a high achiever in her school, and Star is a working class young boy of Eastern European and North African heritage, and he's also a high achiever too. Lulabelle finds science interesting in general, but she finds school science really boring. As you can see, all we do is stare at the board, right, stare at the board, right. Star has a very strong maths and computing identity. He also finds school science boring. As you can see there, copy, 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 check if you know it, copy, copy, copy. Not all of our excellent pedagogy is making it into their classrooms. Lulabelle has a very sort of conflicted relationship both with science and with school in general. So she talks about being picked on for being clever. As you see there, since she started, they don't really accept me. They pick on her. And she aspires to be a primary school teacher. Star enjoys coding at home. He's sort of largely self-taught in that respect, and he aspires to be a computer programmer. No. Come back. There we go. So, on the programmes, Lulabelle was like the perfect participant. She loved everything. She was super enthusiastic. She got involved in everything. When someone said, yeah, this was a really good day, she said, no, this was the best day I've ever done, ever. She loved it. She loved the practical parts. She loved the arts, integration with the science. She loved everything. Star had more mixed experiences, and that's the reason I've selected these two as at the two extremes of that programme. He was most comfortable in the classroom sessions, but he did often try and dominate. He would do that, talking science through muscular intellect, shouting out the right answer, telling off others who got it wrong. He really disliked getting muddy, he didn't like the art and craft, and he didn't like teamwork, and he was scared of the animals. And when he didn't like it, he could be disruptive. But in terms of their outcomes, they both achieved good outcomes. They had very different experiences, but I think they both got a lot out of the programme. Lulabelle, as we know, loved it. She had a whole range of personal, positive, equitable outcomes, we'd say. She increased her knowledge, her skills. She developed STEM capital, personal confidence, eco-agency, for example, changing her carbon footprint, taking action in the world around ecological themes. And Star, even though he was quite disruptive and didn't like lots of parts of it, still really enjoyed it. When we caught up with him 4 or 5 months later, he gave it 4.9 out of 5. We hadn't asked him to rate it on a scale, but he did. He also derived a range of positive and what we would say is equitable outcomes. So as you can see there, he also increased knowledge, he stopped hating biology, he overcome his fear of animals, he also developed a strong eco-agency. He changed his behaviours over the week, and he, for example, he became committed to not wrecking the environment, he turned pescatarian, and so on, as a result of the programme. So we're interested in what enables these positive outcomes for these young people. Can we trace it back in any way to the practice that's going on in that setting? And what can that tell us about the potential for change and supporting young people? So for these two young people, there are about 4 practices that were highlighted. So the first was very inclusive pedagogical practices. Lulabelle described it as Karl making it so that everyone gets a go. Interestingly, Karl's equitable pedagogy supported both of the young people, although it meant closing down some of Star's interactions in some cases. It didn't harm either of their outcomes, and it did work for both of them. The setting was also very good at broadening what counts as ways of being and doing in STEM. And this is something we've talked about in other research as well, coming back to Borja, this idea of changing the field, shifting the field to let more forms of youth capital and habitus engage and be recognised and valued. Lulabelle talked about it, you learn so much more because you're actually doing something. And these enabled consequential outcomes, even for Star, when he didn't enjoy them. It didn't matter that he didn't always have fun. They were very good at designing for collectively orientated empowerment. So by this I mean that the programme had a very strong agenda of trying to develop youth's eco-agency so that they could become more environmentally aware, take action to protect the environment. And they had very equitable, meaning caring relationships with the educator, with Karl. The relationship between the young people and Karl was really important for both of them. Star's turning pescatarian, we would trace back to a conversation he had with Karl at the end of a day when he stayed on to ask him, why are you vegetarian? And they had a discussion, and there were moments of of Star being recorded thinking really thoughtfully about it, and he later changed how he ate in his life. And they had lots of personal discussions like, do you have phobias, and so on. So if we're going to use Borges to make sense of this, we'd say that what makes the practices equitable is the way that they shift dominant relations of power and representation. So the thing that makes a practice equitable is the extent to which it challenges what counts as official knowledge, opening it up, making it broader. What counts as ways of being recognised as doing science, so not just getting the answer right, and so on. What gets valued? How are young people represented and recognised in this setting? But that only tells us so much. It doesn't tell us particularly about why Karl's relationship with the young people was important or consequential. So he doesn't explain really why that relationship is important, mainly because Borgia tends to talk about emotion and love quite negatively, which is very sad, I think. Sad Borgia. He tends to associate emotions like love more with coercion. Coming back to the toffee penny, I think, of masculine domination there. But whereas instead we found that when we look at black feminist and critical education approaches which foreground love, as in the notion of the pedagogy of love, this is much more productive. This helps us understand how notions of love and care can be used as a political statement and a productive resource in working with young people. So the recent book by Nazir et al. Called We Dare to Love, working with African American young men, talking about this different sort of critical pedagogy that can be really important. And we would agree that it's important to centre notions of love and care in emancipatory pedagogy, so in critical work that we do in any educational setting. And Borgia also doesn't account well for why this institution has institutionalised practices that value equity and seek to challenge social reproduction. So this brings us to the question of, can things change, and what should be the role of the critically engaged scholar or the sociologist of education in this? So we're coming back up here on the graph if you're mapping your progress. We've gone quite low down for a bit, but now we're coming back up. So I think it's important to recognise that there is societal progress on inequalities. Things are definitely not perfect, but some things do sometimes improve. So in our research, we would like to hold on to that notion that we did find equitable outcomes among young people. We did, in some of the projects, find more inclusive classroom practice. We found happier teachers, as some of them put it, which is always a good thing, I would say. Admittedly, these are smaller, more localised, more temporary in time than we would want, but we think if we're going to have a politics of hope, that these still require holding on to and keeping sight of in amongst a bigger picture of there's a long way to go. So what's the role or any value of educational sociology of education research in this? So traditionally, people like Michael Apple have written about how the role of sociology of education is to be the critical secretary to society. So the idea that sociology of education will document inequalities, bring them to light, show them up for what they are, or as Borgia puts it, shining a spotlight on the blinkers. And there's a wonderful, rich history of critical research in this area. Our approach tries to go develop from this further towards the notion of praxis, which again, there's a lot, it's a long history of there. The idea of theoretical reflection and action, as Freire puts it, reflection and action upon the world in order to transform it. That's why we've been particularly committed to doing research and development projects, trying to work in partnership with policy and practice and young people. And this partnership work has been really valuable for us in a lot of ways. I've found that it's really made us push our thinking forward, because often, as a sociologist, I'd say sometimes perhaps we collectively use a bit of jargon every now and again, and that maybe sometimes we can hide behind that. We can say things that we think we all know what they're saying, but actually when you're trying to translate that into policy and practice and you're forced to strip away some of the pomp in some cases around that, it really does push you to say, what is it that you're actually arguing and thinking here? So we've tried to engage in praxis through these partnerships and have developed various, what we'd say, thinking tools in that. So some of you will know, perhaps ad nauseam, the notion of the bag, a science capital, the candle. And in a minute, there's a new one. We've got a compass as well. But the thing I also want to make a point around is that for us, partnership work has not just been productive, it has also been really importantly sustaining, hopeful and inspiring. And I think without that partnership work, it could feel very depressing at times. So I wanted to share an example of our current ongoing thinking. So this really is the unreleased material, which is that we found when we were working with organisations that, particularly if we're talking about things like the science capital teaching approach, The key to that is the idea of getting a social justice mindset. And we were worried that the way we'd been explaining things to date didn't help support that social justice thinking. So in the Youth Equity and STEM project, we've been trying to try out different ways that this might work. We've been also developing it in work that Heather and I have been doing with colleagues at the Institute of Physics and the teachers, trying out ideas of this with physics teachers as well as with colleagues at the Science Museum as well. And the idea of this is a reflection tool to try and understand what might social justice mindset look like, how might we know that we're being equitable in our practice, and how could we think about and reflect on how we could improve even further. So this is what's being provisionally called, this is the informal science education one, the ISE Equity Compass. As a physics teacher rightly pointed out to me, it's not really a compass because a compass only has one point, and this has many points, which is correct. But the point of the compass is to help orientate you to a social justice mindset. So just work with the analogy. It's not very. But the idea of the compass here is trying to think, well, what do we mean by social justice? If we were going to think about a practice, what are the key points that we might need to think about? So, for example, if you're looking at the orange one, to what extent does the practice reproduce or challenge and transform existing dominant power relations? In whose interest is it, the blue one at the top? Is this something that's serving the needs and is driven by the needs and values and interests of underserved communities, or is it in the needs of science in the institution? Is it building capital and capacity in terms of participatoriness, the purple one? Is it being done to the young people? Is it being done for them? Or is it being done with them? So it's just a reflective tool. And as you may guess, the closer you are to the centre, the less equitable it is. What we're trying to do is move outwards. And of course, it is a never-ending compass because we can always improve. It extends forever. But the idea is we're trying to use this as a tool to think, if I'm thinking about my practice, whether I'm in a science centre exploding some custard, as I believe sometimes happens, or if I'm in a school teaching a Key Stage 3 science lesson, how might I think about those practices through an equity lens? To what extent are they reproducing or challenging dominant relations? And the idea is also to help people think about, if you do it like a spider diagram, you can map yourself and then gradually map yourself going outwards. Of course, there are ongoing challenges. Collaborative working takes time and resource. And I guess this is my particular note to all the funders out there. I think research practice partnership working is really important for equity, but it needs proper funding, it needs to be longer term, it needs time. For our own work, I'd say that sometimes concepts which are popular, which get taken up, which have a resonance and an elasticity, like science capital, is great, but it can also lead to dilution and simplification, or there are challenges in the translation. And I think in the case of definitely my own work, there's always that danger of metaphor overload. How many can we possibly cope with? More, I hear, yeah. And also a challenge that was raised to me in a conference about a year ago. It was in a session, I was giving a talk on Science Capital, and I was talking after David Putnam, who'd done a very, very powerful piece on, a short version is The World is Going to End. And they said, well, why are you working with young people? Because we can't wait 12 years for change. It's too late. What's the point? At the time, I wasn't quick enough to think, but obviously when you go away and think of the answer you would have liked to give, that answer, that question assumes that young people have no agency and that we have to wait for them to go through education before they can act upon the world. And I think it's really useful and powerful to see the examples of people like Greta Thunberg and all the youth protests, that young people do have agency. And so it's the role of engaging young people, whether it's through formal or informal science education, to support and enhance and help build that agency for them to take action towards things that are important in their lives for challenging inequalities. And this is an area of work that we're hoping to develop and take forward through the work we're currently doing with teachers and informal science educators. That's the very low point, coming up to a high point. So, to conclude, inequalities are persistent and intractable because the elite benefit from them. So the theme coming through from Borja very strongly is that privilege is achieved through subordination. So this has very strong implications for if we think we're working in the field of equity to try and change this. So I've referred to this as the zero-sum game of social justice. We can't widen participation while also maintaining privilege and eliteness, because it won't work. To actually, let's say, widen participation in science or in any area, it means the dismantling of privilege. It means that we do have to recognise those complex and multiple forms of privilege and be prepared and have to give them up. So we talk about this as the imperative of intentional equity. So for me, equity has to be foregrounded. The reason we might need a social justice compass to be applied to everything is because the default position is not neutral. The default position is the reproduction of the status quo, the reproduction of inequalities. So if equity isn't foregrounded, we can be very sure that even if we can't see it through processes like pedagogic action and symbolic violence, that inequalities are being reproduced. But some practices, I would argue, can make a difference. So we can find these in moments and in particular settings. And I think there's a value there in trying to recognise them and bring them to light. So there are some examples there of some of the practices we think may be making a difference in one of our studies, in one of our settings. But the key is also for us this notion of we should be trying to change the field and not the young person. So I say that sociology education has a value and it can support change, particularly when working in partnership with policy and practice and communities. So in this respect, I'm going to suggest the goal of our academic service, our purpose here, is working with and not for others, and definitely not doing unto others. So sociology education, I think, is important in bringing injustices to light. But I think we also have an important role in trying to help build shared understanding, to, for example, contribute useful thinking tools. There's often not a lot we can change personally as academics. We may like to think we're all powerful. We strangely have limited power in that respect. But also our role in supporting collective action, I think, needs to be brought to the fore. So, on that note, I have tried to bring us through that cocktail of optimism and pessimism to our landing point at the end of that I think it's the red wine glass exemplifying it here, of half full, half empty. But whatever institutional portion you get at the wine reception afterwards, I would like to just take the opportunity to virtually top up your virtual glass now with a final image. And I'm going to show you a picture of a wall, of specifically a mural that was created by young people at one of our partner settings who were part of a youth justice programme. And I've spoken a lot tonight, but I'm going to let the final image speak for itself.
Louise, that was predictably brilliant and stimulating. Thank you. I mean, you really drew out the complex processes of both exclusion, societal and structural exclusion, and self-exclusion, but you also took us through inclusion. And I think the bringing back in of agency here, the challenge to us all of dismantling privilege, and the role of the critically engaged scholar are messages that will certainly stay with me, and I'm sure for all our colleagues. And I thought your example of Victor really also exemplified the productivity of your longitudinal work. You know, the quotes that we had through Victor's life, which of course is exemplified across thousands of students in Louise's cohort studies, and the power of that for scholarship is really impressive. So thank you for bringing us to the glass half full. And we're now going to have a short response to Louise's lecture. And our respondent this evening is Catherine Matheson, Chief Executive of the British Science Association. Thank you, Catherine, for joining us this evening. Now, Catherine's a biologist by training, and her early career included stints at the Forensic Science Service, Science Line, and the pharmaceutical company Merck, as well as Nesta, the Innovation Foundation, where she directed its portfolio of science education and science communication projects. From there, Catherine moved to the British Science Association, the mission of which is to make science a more fundamental part of our culture and society. As the BSA's Director of Education, Catherine coordinated its outreach activities for schools, and then in 2016 she took up the helm as Chief Executive. During that time, Catherine had been involved in numerous projects concerned with promoting access to science in collaboration with the likes of, among others, the Institute of Physics and King's College London. And she's brought the same ethos of diversity and inclusion to the BSA itself. So I, for one, can think of few people better placed than Catherine to give their reflections on the themes that we've covered this evening. Catherine, can I invite you to give your response to the lecture?
Thanks very much, and thanks for the invitation to be here. I really appreciate it. As Becky said right at the beginning, Professor Louise Archer's work has had a significant impact within academia, but also beyond academia. And I want to give you a bit of a flavour of some of that impact that I've been particularly aware of. Louise is the Vice President for Education at the British Science Association, so obviously that involves coming to talk to my colleagues and I and dispensing great wisdom, and she does that very well. But it also, for those of you involved in charity governance, that's being a member of our Board of Trustees. So there's quite a lot of other responsibilities to that as well. She gets to delve into the management accounts and the annual report and worry about, you know, risk and all of these other things that aren't usually part of an academic's world. And so I want to pay tribute to Louise and the institution and her colleagues for enabling that kind of work to go on, because it is tremendously important to us. And this work has really shaped the British Science Association's approach. As some of you will know, the organisation is nearly 200 years old, and that's quite a lot of time to develop habits about what we do and the way that we do it. And Louise's work has really helped us change the work that we do and the way that we do it. We are seeking to extend participation in science, science engagement, science education. And that means that we're really painfully aware of the ways that young people and adults are pushed away from science in their education and in their daily lives. Some work that we did showed us that around 25% of the UK population says that they were put off science by their schooling. And so it's really important for us to understand more about the mechanisms by which that happens. But as Louise showed in her talk, many of our intuitions around those mechanisms are wrong. So the intuition that people are put off by science, a science education, because it's seen as a clever thing, that feels quite intuitively familiar. But the work on setting is quite counterintuitive, I would say. And something around the way that stereotypes form and are solidified. So the idea that the people who think physics is most odd, male and geeky are the people studying physics at A-level. That's really counterintuitive, I think. So without work like this that really shows up the ways in which inequalities are embedded in everyone's experience of STEM, how would we effectively change the situation? A couple of examples for you. Some of you who know the British Science Association's work will know our Crest Awards scheme for young people's own project work in science and related subjects. And what we've done in the 10 years that I've been part of the British Science Association is really highlighted the ways that those projects can be personalised and relevant to young people's everyday lives. So, for example, one of the resources that we had 10 years ago, and I don't want to sort of be passing judgment on this. This was people doing the best that they knew how to at the time. You know, before Louise's work and related work came about, there was a sort of experiment for kids to do to test whether a Persian carpet was real or not real. A Persian carpet in their parents' house was like fake or real. And I don't know how many kids that really represents everyday life for. Possibly not very many. And now they can do experiments like which crisps are the most crispy and what does my hamster do while I'm asleep at night. And that feels a little bit more kind of widely relatable to a wider section of the population. And Crest Awards are increasingly not just for high ability students. And increasingly we are targeting our resources at primary age pupils rather than secondary age pupils, where there's more of a chance to make a difference to more young people. And my colleague Jane leads our education team, who target resources at underserved audiences across the UK. So we weight the resources that we put in towards the young people who are least likely to access that sort of thing in other ways. For British Science Week, which I hope many of you have participated in over the 20-odd years that it's been running, we have become more playful, more inclusive. We have worked hard to work with community groups across the UK. And again, we have a much more active focus on targeting underserved audiences. So although we still reach over 1 million people, as we did 20 years ago, the people that we reach are quite different, maybe, from the ones that we reached a couple of decades ago. And last year, we started our first all-party parliamentary group on diversity and inclusion in STEM. And Louise was one of the very first speakers at one of the very first meetings and slightly stole the limelight, you will be unsurprised to hear. So that when the APPG launched its first inquiry this year, the topic of that inquiry is about social inequality in education, which can be traced directly back to that very early presentation by Louise. There were some other presentations last year as well, but clearly none of them quite hit the mark as much as Louise's did. So her work has influenced the British Science Association's work across the board, across the UK, across all of our programmes. And I think, without drawing too much attention to the chaos that's going on in government right now, because we don't need to talk about that, right? But I wonder if it shows us perhaps the ways in which government's ability to change the world are limited. I think it's really important that for academics, they seek not just to understand the world, but also to change the world. And so I think listening to Louise's talk, it's difficult to hear about things like the rigged bingo machine of education without wanting to change that. And so thank you to Louise, to her many supporters, her many collaborators, for enabling us to collectively, I hope, change the world. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Catherine. Colleagues, this has been both a challenging session and lecture, but also an encouraging one. I think we'll all have so many issues to discuss over a drink. But thank you again, and I hope that you'll all join with me now in thanking Louise and congratulating her, and Catherine as well for her response, before you join us all for a drink with that glass half full. Thank you.